But to quote him, "As I grew a bit older, and as my own scars started to heal, I wanted to love humankind. It was noble, admirable, and certainly correct. But as I was getting older still, I concluded that loving mankind is both easy and impossible. And the realization that the commandment, 'You shall love your neighbour as yourself,' is not a simple thing. For when it comes to your neighbour, that's different from humanity or mankind. There, you do have proximity and opportunity, and loving becomes more complicated. With an actual neighbour, many things are thrown into relief. Differences, strong likes, also dislikes and prejudices, snap judgments, different sounds, smells and peculiar sensitivities. And then came the real rub. We don't actually know our neighbour, and until you know him or her, you cannot really understand, accept, like, never mind love. And it seems to me that dialogue is the way towards the commandment." Now, I too had the notion that dialogue is a useful practice, and in 1999, looking for a model on which to base Daughters of Abraham, a dialogue group for Jewish and Muslim women, I first stumbled across the work of David Bohm, and I'd like to tell you about him. I'd been invited along with one of my co-founders, Yasmin Alabai-Brown, to talk about the group to the Jewish Women's Network. Afterwards, an elderly woman introduced herself to me as Sarah Bohm. She handed me a paper written by her late husband, Professor David Bohm, which she said I'd find of interest, and then she disappeared into the crowd. I got home and pulled it out of my bag. It said, "We are proposing a kind of collective inquiry, not only into the content of what each of us says, thinks, and feels, but also into the underlying motivations, assumptions, and beliefs that lead us to do so." I couldn't believe my luck. This was exactly the sort of blueprint that I'd been looking for on which to base my dialogue group. There was an email address on the back of the pamphlet, and I wrote to Sarah, but the email bounced back. Some weeks later, I was going to Israel for Passover. It was at exactly this time of the year. At Ben Gurion Airport, queuing at passport control, I saw Sarah standing in the next line. It turned out to be the first of many coincidences, including the fact that we both shared the ridiculous birthday of New Year's Eve. She gave me a list of all of Bohm's books, and once back in London, I devoured them. His insights into communication could be applied to almost any field of human activity, and my head buzzed with possibilities. One book in particular, on dialogue, was so inspiring that I recommended it to all my friends, an accolade reserved for classics such as James Hillman's The Soul's Code or Machiavelli's The Prince. In it, Bohm writes, "Dialogue is a way of observing, collectively, how hidden values and intentions can control our behaviour, and how unnoticed cultural differences can clash without our realising what is occurring. It can therefore be seen as an arena in which collective learning takes place, and out of which a sense of increased harmony, fellowship, and creativity can arise." Now, it feels very fitting to be talking about David Bohm here at Imperial College. He was regarded by Albert Einstein as his intellectual successor, and hailed by the Dalai Lama as his scientific guru. He was the last graduate student of Robert Oppenheimer, known to posterity as the father of the A-bomb. Bohm was forced to leave America by McCarthy's henchmen, and eventually became Professor of Theoretical Physics at Birkbeck College in London. For many years, he was disturbed by the failure of communication between his fellow scientists. He also saw that this failure was pervasive in modern society, causing dangerous fragmentation. To counter this, in the 1980s, Bohm began experimenting with a process he called group dialogue. He writes, "Dialogue comes from a Greek word, dialogos. Logos meaning the word, or the meaning, and dia meaning through, not to. So it gets across the notion of a communication or an energy flowing among people, between them, and through the space between them, rather than a discussion in which we go back and forth, arguing and trying to make our points. He proposed, Bohm, that through dialogue we might change our collective thought processes and find solutions to problems without being misled by our assumptions. What is essential here, he writes, is the presence of the spirit of dialogue, which is, in short, the ability to hold many points of view in suspension, along with a primary interest in the creation of a common meaning. Central to his work, from quantum theory to the nature of consciousness, was the notion of undivided wholeness. In 1962, Bohm wrote, "To see the whole truth, you must not be in a state of conflict between what is and a motivation as to what should be. What should be is always an illusion, which prevents you from looking at what is. Conflict fragments the mind and is therefore incompatible with a state of understanding in which the mind sees a totality." Bohm found it disturbing that the two greatest scientists of the 20th century, Albert Einstein and Niels Bohr, once very close friends, had fallen out so badly with each other that they couldn't talk to each other or even be in the same room together. He writes, "They had two different assumptions about what was the way to truth. Bohr's judgments were based on his view of quantum theory, and Einstein's on his view of relativity. They talked it over again and again in a very patient way, with all goodwill. It went on for years, and neither of them yielded. Each one just repeated what he had been saying before. So finally, they found that they weren't getting anywhere, and they gradually drifted apart. They didn't see each other for a long time after that. Then, one year, both of them were at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, but they still didn't meet each other. A mathematician named Herman Weyl said, 'It would be nice if they got together. It's a pity that they don't.' So he arranged a party to which Einstein and Bohr and their respective students were invited. Einstein and his associates stayed at one end of the room, and Bohr and his associates stayed at the other end. They couldn't get together because they had nothing to talk about. They couldn't share any meaning because each one felt his meaning was true. In a dialogue, they might have listened properly to each other's opinion, and perhaps they both would have suspended their opinions and moved out beyond relativity and beyond quantum theory into something new." In my dialogue group, Daughters of Abraham, our dialogue group, because dialogue is always owned by all the participants, from time to time there were tensions, but curiously these were mostly between co-religionists. The Sephardi woman who felt that Ashkenazi Jews were insensitive to her tradition, and between those Muslim women who covered their hair and those women who didn't. The dialogue often continued between meetings. Then, following a spate of suicide bomb attacks, one of the Jewish women with whom I'd been particularly close became so fearful for her family in Israel that she began to see all Palestinians as barbarians. I clung to my assumption that they're not, and for several years we were unable to talk to each other. But such is the strength of understanding that can develop when you really get to know each other, that we're now back on good terms again, though we tend to stay clear of discussions about the Middle East. There were also moments that were profoundly gratifying, like the time when one of the Muslim women gave birth to a son and called to ask me to recommend someone to perform a circumcision. However, I have to say that after hostilities between Israelis and Palestinians reignited in September 2000, several of the Muslim women withdrew, and it became increasingly difficult to find new recruits. But I like to think that we were all enriched by the experience. It was an intense period of discovery. I learned not just about Islam, but also about the parameters of my own identity, both as a Jew and as a woman. It equipped me to deal with disputes less emotionally, to question the validity of my own beliefs and assumptions, and consider those of people with whom I'm in conflict, to look for the bigger picture. And I'll leave the last word to Professor Bohm. There is the possibility of the transformation of consciousness both individually and collectively. It's important that it happens together. It's got to be both. And I wish you all great fortune with your own experience of dialogue.